energy governance sort of more broadly and energy transition. Traditional forms of energy. So, and I'd like to hear from all of you, what are the forms of energy? And then let's think a little bit about, are the supply lines long or short? Do you need distribution networks? Are there security or safety issues associated with it? Are there sort of levels of investment, multi-year planning? So I just want to hear from you guys. Tell me a little bit about these forms of energy. Animal traction, animal mobility, we're using wind, human muscle power, what's that called, kinetic energy or something. Again human, and again human, and then the fuel source there is localized. So you can see that the fuel sources are local, the energy carriers are local. You have your cow in the field next to you. If you need your grain to be milled, you do it yourself. Okay, so you wouldn't, in this kind of regime, you wouldn't have your central government running the show. You wouldn't even have your municipal government running the show. It would be predominantly, I would say, at a household level.
That's not true for hand pumps.
And it's not true for hand pumps. Yeah, exactly. So what we're starting to see is already the emergence of some involvement in the story. Okay, so that's almost like the next level up. Same with windmills. So someone starts manufacturing them and installing them. Okay, so we start to see, with a hand pump, it'll usually be a state entity or an NGO kind of entity coming in, and here we starting to see sort of a private sector supplying some of the energy, the means towards your energy. Okay, so in terms of a fossil fuel story, can you see how dramatically the picture's changed? So when you're supplying electricity, you've got these enormous grids, you've got enormous sunk investment, you've got 50-year horizons, you've got massive security issues. If one of these things goes down, your entire country's taken out. So suddenly and similarly with you can't see it here, but your fuel in terms of gas and diesel. You're talking about international trade relations, you've got these long supply lines coming into the country, you've got a massive security when that fuel comes in, you've got to protect it. So it's a very different regime. And a very different set of governance is going to surround that kind of a regime. So suddenly you get states involved, you get national energy policies, you have big businesses involved. It's a very different story to what we saw before. Then thinking about sustainable energy, which is a kind of it's the first thing that struck me, I don't know if it struck you, but it's just that there's a highly varied response in terms of sustainable energy. So some of it is sort of fairly traditional still, bicycles. Some of it is still very high-tech, big-scale renewable, electrification of informal areas. You've got your public transport still reliant on your imported gasoline, but then you've got low-tech wonder bags, using the sun, your Messina carts. So it's greatly varied. And I suppose what I'm putting forward is that the energy governance regime is still sitting pretty much here. That's where most of our energy governance sits, in those big systems. But in fact, what's happening is this rapid technology change, and then I'd argue one step further also rapid demographic change. So the governance has not, in a sense, caught up with what's happening on the ground. Just to recap, a lot of those things within sustainable energy, when you unpack them, they sit within a local government sort of typical set of functions. I'm not going to go into it because you've seen a lot of these, but just to name a few: your public lighting, your public buildings. Even here we saw with the Messina carts, the role of the local authority in that initiative. We've got biogas from wastewater treatment, gas from, and electricity from waste. So quite a lot of it is starting to sit within the local government space. So what happens then to the sort of energy governance regime, so to speak? Interestingly, we've got a lot of commitments globally that Mark talked about yesterday to sustainable development, to sustainable energy for all. But when you unpack them, there's very little reference to local government. So in terms of how we're going to achieve this, very little reference to local government. National energy policies, as I've said, still very little reference to local government. Okay, so we did a little assessment of what is the mandate and what is not just the mandate, but also the level of effecting that mandate, which are two slightly different things. We took the sort of criteria really from there's a UCLGA and Cities Alliance document on assessing the institutional environment of local government in Africa. But really looking at the constitutional and legal mandates for local government, and then what is the fiscal capacity, what is the muscle behind that. Okay, that's a long and boring slide because law becomes quite long and boring, but I'm going to try and go through it fairly quickly. Okay, so in terms of local government, and Jeremy from Kampala City yesterday talked about this a little bit. Local government is set up obviously in the constitution, so that's the first place to start. What you find across Uganda, Ghana, South Africa is that all of our constitutions make provision for decentralized government. But you find quite a difference in terms of the level of devolution. And I'm going to quickly ask, do people understand the difference between decentralization and devolution?
Might be worth explaining.
Yeah, Daniel's shaking her head there. Okay, so decentralized, and Ghana forms the better example of decentralized. It's when your national government creates local centers of government, but they're essentially centers of national government located regionally. Devolution is when you hand over real powers to that local government to raise taxes and to create their own laws. Never counter to the national laws, but they are empowered to actually be lawmaking bodies. Okay, so when we look at that a little bit, you find that Ghana is the most decentralized and least devolved.
Yeah.
Uganda, in theory, is quite highly devolved. So your constitution and your local government law makes provision for a high level of devolution. But it's a big chicken and egg story. It says it's based on a pragmatic approach which says when local government proves they are able to do this, they may have this power. But then it doesn't give you any money to do it, so it never gives you the power. So it remains a fairly theoretical devolution. So we'll look at that. South Africa is fairly devolved. So South African, as we've picked up, South African local governments employ their own staff, for instance. Never happens at a national level. They employ their own staff, and they are able to make their own laws. It is fairly devolved. And of course, I suspect many African leaders are saying, yeah, look what happens. You devolve a local government, and what happens? The cities fall into the hands of the opposition. So it's a very political question, very, very political question. But in terms of sustainability and empowering cities, the more powers at the local level, it does seem the better. Okay, so that sets up your local government. Now, the functional areas of local government, what local government is mandated to do, is then set out in your schedules and your local government legislation. I'm not going to go into it in a huge amount of detail, but very typically, across all countries, planning, building control, public lighting and facilities, waste management, sewage, wastewater treatment, public transport infrastructure. Very common functions across the three countries of local government. Economic development and social services generally are shared with regional or central government. So South African cities have a local economic development function, but a lot of the social services such as education and health are actually at the provincial level. Interestingly, and I think very importantly, the protection of the local environment is a very strong function of local government across all three countries. And I think we'll come back to that. Electricity and energy distribution, only in South Africa is that specified as a function of local government. So we've talked about your constitutional establishment, then your functions, and then quite importantly, the activities designated within those functions. So if we look at, say, building control, in Ghana, for instance, building control is a very strong function, but whether they are able to regulate and actually create new bylaws around buildings is the activity level. And I think in Ghana you are able to create local bylaws around building, I think. Am I right? I'm not sure. So in South Africa you can, but very often the local government will be designated the control of what are standards building bylaws set nationally. So that's the kind of level of activity that's looked at. So the levels of control vary a fair degree, and you need to look into that. But then, very importantly, many of the functions don't specify their activities. So when it says environmental protection of your local resources, often it won't specify how you do that. And that, I'm going to put forward here and propose, opens up a nice space to explore. Okay, so going back, so given that constitutional setup, do local government have a sustainable energy mandate? Yesterday, Jeremy mentioned sustainable energy is often implicit and not explicit. So nowhere does it say in the functions, apart from South Africa, to distribute electricity, but nowhere else does it say you must do sustainable energy, you must do energy in any form. But it is implicit in many of those functions. We've talked about that quite a bit. It often requires doing what you are already doing, but doing it differently. And that sounds so simple. It's not simple, obviously. So it's important to sort of pick that up, because that's where the barriers come in. So take solar street lighting, which Kampala City Authority spoke about yesterday. If you want to do what you do already, you do street lighting, now you want to do solar street lighting. You've got to find out about the technology, you've got to cost it, you've got to check that the lighting standards align with the lighting standards of the country, and that might mean moving your spacing of your pillars. You've got to get your maintenance staff that are already overworked to now go and retrofit. You've got to find the funding. You've got to deal with the old light bulbs, where you're going to put them, are you going to trash them, sell them on. So you need extra resources. It's not, doing it differently is not as simple as it sounds. And then, as I'm proposing, engaging new areas or programs of work. So we heard from Kampala yesterday, they are starting to work with efficient cook stoves, because they see this environmental protection is really important. That is not a designated activity of local government in Uganda, but they are starting to move into that space because they see it as critical for their mandate of protecting the surrounding environment. Okay, so may you do this? May you do these new activities? Someone in your financial office might say, sorry David, we're not going to put up solar street lights because that's not our job. Our job is just to put up street lighting. I can't do that, I can't authorize, I may not sign this authorization of additional budget, it's not our job. If we look at the Constitution, it says that objectives of the state should guide a municipality in exercising its powers. In all three constitutions, the objectives of the state include sustainable development and protecting the environment. So there's a very, very strong commitment from all three countries to sustainable development and environmental protection. In South Africa and Uganda, it goes as far as to mention that this extends to local governments specifically. So you must, when you exercise your functions, you must take into account sustainable development and environmental protection. In fact, so you can say to your finance manager, you are not doing your job if you're putting up old street lights. In fact, your job is to be protecting the environment. Okay, and just a legal opinion that confirms this. This was in South Africa, but hopefully it will apply. It's saying that there's no reason to assume that your competencies may not deal with the interests of the environment or sustainable development, even if the proposed activity doesn't relate to historic considerations. So building regulation historically deals with aesthetics, safety, but you may now include environmental protection into that. Energy efficiency. That's what this legal opinion is saying. It is entirely within your constitutionally mandated rights to bring these into your existing activities. And in addition, that legal opinion said new national policies may also nominate new activities to be included. So when your government signs a climate change agreement internationally, in effect they are nominating new activities down into local government. That said, what is your fiscal muscle to do this? Okay, okay, the first graph, they're a little bit faint. The first graph is average subnational expenditure as a percentage of total expenditure. So across the globe, how much are governments spending on local government? What do you see at this graph? Okay, so this is not in absolute terms. It doesn't matter how rich or poor the country is. Relative to your total budget in Africa, very little is spent on local government. So you're highly centralized in terms of your public spending. So that's the first thing. If we break Africa up into the countries, and apologies here to Ghana, the data didn't have Ghana, I don't know why, so you're not in here. But what really stands out is across all the countries, South Africa and Senegal and Zimbabwe stand out as much, much higher proportion of national government spending is going to local government. Interestingly, Senegal is the other country in Africa that has a highly devolved constitutional mandate down to local government. So when you have the constitution, it does, the money follows through once that devolution is in place. And then lastly, just looking at Ghana, South Africa and Uganda, the proportion of the funding of municipalities in those countries that comes from central government. What we're effectively looking at here is how much can your local government raise its own funding, okay, through taxes and so on. And again, what we see here is, even though South Africa is getting a lot from from national, in fact, that forms only 25% of its total budget. So South African local government is raising 75% of its finance locally, from local taxes. In Ghana, it's much smaller. Local taxes are only about 20%, and in Uganda, even less, sort of just, yeah, local, no, even more. So Uganda's a little bit more, 30% or so. Okay, so hugely dependent on national government still, and that obviously is going to affect your ability to carry out new work and your own agenda, so to speak. Very last slide is, if we look at your human capacity, your legal capacity, your financial capacity, what do we find? We find that obviously and this is a bit like Simon's net mapping here, we have level of influence of government, of local government, so how much financial, legal, human capacity you have, that's high, versus impact on energy, on achieving sustainable energy. This is low and that's high. So there's a lot of control in local government on your own facilities, and obviously your street lighting and so on, okay? So you've got a lot of control, but it's not a great impact in terms of sustainable energy. Very important, though, to get started here and to lead by example. Less influence, and this is, Jeremy from Kampala talked about also the indirect influence. So through planning, building control, public transport services, less influence, and again, it becomes quite a lot more varied between the countries. Less influence, but quite a bit of a higher impact. So it's not good enough to stop here if you want to affect some sort of sustainable energy transition. You've got to start moving into these areas and building your muscle, so to speak, on influencing those areas. The very far outliers, the greatest impact on sustainable energy is when people start to, in fact, generate electricity and supply local, embedded, distributed, renewable energy in their own areas. Very high impact, because you can make sure that's all renewable energy, and you also start to have a far greater sort of control on the access to energy as well in your municipality. So that is the area that people have got to start moving into. It's the area where Simon talked about the reality of vested interests and the kind of economic challenges. You know, these are wealthy industries, people already control them. How much can you move into that space? National government controls it. How much is national government and its associated utilities prepared to start letting go? But technologies are driving us very strongly in that direction, which is obviously exciting. Okay, so just in conclusion, so we're saying that there's arguably a strong sustainable energy mandate at the local level. How? It's not explicit, which means that you have to make the case and you have to push to some extent, because you're pushing into new areas, people are reluctant to take it up, it means more work, it means more money, often in the immediate term. It means savings often in the longer term, okay? But in practice, the reality is that there's a slow or partial implementation of administrative and fiscal decentralization and devolution. So I think we all know that. So in theory, we can do it. In practice, often we don't have the resources, even if we have the constitutional mandate, we don't have the resources. The reality also is that moving into the space requires new skills, so there needs to be an active process of capacitating people. And then I think a very important message is that while it's really problematic that local government isn't identified as a key stakeholder in achieving the global goals and commitments around SE for all, the Millennium Development Goals, or what are they called now, the Sustainable SDGs, that there's no reason, therefore, to wait. So local government does have the mandate, and the experience is that when you start to open up those spaces, you start to gain the resources. So don't just say, we can't do it, we don't have money. Start, and the money will follow, is actually certainly the experience of, we heard Cape Town's journey 15 years. There was no money, there was no staff in Cape Town 15 years ago. They started regardless, and the money and the staffing followed the initiative.
Thank you.